All right, good morning, everybody. I see participants joining. Hello, good morning, everybody, or good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are. All right. So we're going to get started on time. This is being recorded, so if people join later, they'll have a chance to catch up with everything. I'm going to hand over to Kumba Toure to welcome everybody, and then we will get started with the webinar. Just a friendly reminder that you can send us questions for the Q&A in the chat at any time. I will be fielding questions towards the end. But I welcome questions throughout the entire session, so please feel free to ask any questions as they occur to you, and I'll get to as many of them as I can at the end. With that, I would love to hand over to the founder of Invisible Giants, Kumba Toure, to kick us off this morning or afternoon or evening. Kumba, over to you.
Welcome, welcome everyone. This is Kumba Toure speaking to you from Senegal. And yes, initiator, founder of Invisible Giants. I'm a writer and publisher of children's books. So you can find some of them on Kumbati. I'll put it on the chat. But here especially, excited to introduce uh, Christina Inch. She has been in digital infrastructure and outreach for over 18 years. She's the co-founder of the AI-driven life writing platform, Biographica, and a founder of Thoughtlight, a Boston-based digital media agency serving, to harness the power of digital media to serve communities, causes, and businesses. She's a high rated instructor at Harvard University Division for Continuing Education, where she won the FUSA Award for Teaching Excellence and a member of the inaugural group of Inclusive Teaching Fellows, where she researches best practices in inclusive and accessible instructional materials. See, the bio is in the chat. Maybe we can do it again so people can remember and keep it. But what I want to say more, we can read people's bios, but what I could say more about Christina is just her passion about, making media digital accessible. And when I say accessible, it's in many, many different ways, of course, for people. But that passion is something that has transpired from my different interaction with her. And the connection here is that Biographica and Invisible Giants have been, on this path of building and creating things together. While we've been doing this work for a while with Invisible Giants, we also know that invisibility is also happening at the level of the digital. And, we needed people like, Christina to help us figure out that part also. So thank you, Christina, for being here and offering your knowledge in such a generous way. We are all ears and listening, and people can ask questions, can put it on the chat and so on. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Kumba, and I always continue to be amazed at everything that you're doing with Invisible Giants. Welcome, everyone. As Kumba mentioned, online invisibility of different identities and also different abilities is a chronic problem. Far too many websites generally, excuse me, suppressing a sneeze here, are not accessible to people of differing abilities or don't represent the communities they serve. So how can we, as website owners, website developers, or people in charge of an organization's social media, create a more inclusive online environment? We decided to host this webinar as part of Disability Pride Month because what we want to do is show you how easy it is to create a website that is not only fully accessible, but also much more inclusive for people of differing abilities. So with that, I want to share some of the tips that I have learned over the years. My first graduate degree is a master's in instructional design and instructional technology for adult education from the University of Wyoming, and it focused on a lot of user experience design for equity within the learning space. So I have been working on online accessibility and representation throughout my entire digital media career. And I can tell you the core fundamentals over the past 2 decades have changed a lot. So if you are struggling with how do we even know if our website is accessible, let alone our social media, I can tell you you are not alone. We are all looking at multiple different platforms, multiple different websites, social media, video, audio, all kind text, imagery. We have an explosion of content in the 20 years that I've been in the digital media space, and it is difficult to keep on top of all of these and make sure that they are all accessible. But it's doable on any budget. So today we're going to learn how to make our online presence inclusive and accessible for users with diverse needs, whether that's visual impairments, hearing, mobility impairments, or people with cognitive or learning differences. We're going to learn WCAG compliance, which is the gold standard for being Americans with Disabilities Act compliant for your online presence, but we're also going to expand that into more diversity and inclusiveness in our messaging and our imagery across our online footprint. The goal here is to make sure that your website, your social media posts, and all of your digital content are as barrier-free as possible. In other words, everybody, regardless of ability, can use and access your content. So I mentioned WCAG, and that's a really important place to start. So let's get into why is WCAG important and what is it after all? So WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it's a great place to start if you have a website, because it is a complete encyclopedia of what makes a website compliant with Americans with disabilities or simply more accessible to people with disabilities, as well as a cookbook, so to speak, of how to make your site accessible. So it's available online. I'll also send out the links, but just look for WCAG guidelines online and you'll find it is the best guidance for your web accessibility. It is crucial when you're creating an online experience that works for everybody, regardless of their abilities. It supports diversity and equal access to information. And again, many countries actually have laws requiring digital content to meet WCAG standards. Here in the US, if you receive any kind of federal funding, such as being a university or a nonprofit that receives federal funding, you have to be WCAG compliant to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as any organization above a certain number of employees has to be ADA compliant. And WCAG is the standard for what makes a digital presence ADA compliant. It also really guides you into creating a great user experience. So it's not just about complying with the law. WCAG is all about creating a great user experience, both for people with disabilities and all of your users. So if you want a set of standards to which you need to make your site accessible, WCAG is the standard that this is going to guide you towards in this session, because that's going to help ensure that you're ADA compliant. Now, when people think of accessibility, they almost always first and foremost think of blindness. And in fact, when you study accessibility online, you're always told to focus on blindness because that will account for the majority of types of accessibility. So when people who are blind or visually impaired use the web, they tend to use something called a screen reader. This is a piece of software that runs in your browser and that reads the websites for you. So this is not something that you need to add to your own website. This is the tool that blind and visually impaired users use to find your website and to then navigate your website. So it's not something that you add to your own website. What you do to your website, however, impacts the ability of screen readers to understand your website. So you can test your website using a screen reader to determine whether it is something that someone using that screen reader would be able to navigate and understand. So what the screen reader does is it translates digital content into just voice output. It reads it in a little robo voice, and that should enable people who are blind to seamlessly navigate your website and understand what your website is about. Now, the reality, however, for many of our websites is that our sites are not screen reader accessible. A screen reader, in theory, can read anything on the web. You don't need to do anything special to your website to have it be just basically accessible to a screen reader. But the way you have your website structured, the way you have it coded, the way you have images utilized can impact what that screen reader is able to access in your website and actually read to the user. The number one hiccup we often see for websites is the lack of good alt text. So let's say, for instance, you are running a clothing store or you're running a museum, and your museum store is having a special right now: buy one scarf, get the other 50% off. You have a beautiful banner that you created. Maybe you were using Canva and you posted it to your website, and it says buy one scarf, get the other 50% off, and it's there in that picture. Screen readers cannot read pictures. They cannot read the text that is in pictures. So what happens when all of the information related to a particular topic is in a picture is that that is completely invisible to a blind person. The way around this is the utilization of what we call alt text. And this is something that you put in whenever you insert an image into a website with a description for blind users of what is in that picture. So how would that look, for instance, in practice with, for instance, our buy one scarf, get the other 50% off deal? It means that when you upload that photo with that coupon, you would also put in alt text, and that alt text will say exactly what it says on the coupon: buy one, get one, buy one scarf, get the other 50% off, because then the screen reader is able to access the information in that image. But it isn't just images that have text that can be a real problem for screen readers. It can be any image that people gather information from. So for instance, take a look at this slide right here. There's a decorative image of a man in a sort of space age environment utilizing what looks like a laptop or a tablet in front of a screen that's got all sorts of images and symbols on it. It's purely decorative. But imagine if I start to now refer to that image and say, like the guy in the picture, you should count on your users having access to tablets. Well, if you can't see the picture, you cannot make any sense of what I'm saying. And so a lot of times, even though images don't actually have words on them, they carry a lot of meaning that is essential for the understanding of that piece of content. And when you don't have alt text, you are missing that crucial piece of information. So towards the end of this webinar, I'm actually going to demo a screen reader, and I'm going to demo the use of alt text so that you can see what good and bad navigation looks like from the perspective of a blind user, as well as show you how to add that important descriptive information to an image so that people who are blind can access that content. And this is a really critical point as to why accessibility is for everybody. Even though these practices were originally designed simply to help blind users, they carry a variety of other benefits. For instance, a lot of companies now block images from being loaded in emails. So if all of the information in a critical piece of email that you're sending out, like for instance, your organizational newsletter, has information in a photo, now that is being blocked by a lot of email clients. A lot of companies are not allowing their employees' emails to access images by default. And so now, even if your users are sighted, they aren't going to be able to access information if it's locked down inside of an image if they don't turn images on. It's also very useful for your search engine optimization. Google is constantly crawling the web looking for information that it then shows to people whenever they search for something. If your images don't have descriptions, Google has no idea what those images are about, even with advancements in AI a lot of the times. And so your images will not be findable on Google searches. Now, for some people like artists, that's a good thing. They don't want people finding their images on Google and, for instance, stealing them. On the other hand, however, if you have information and you want people to find you on Google through your images without alt text, your images are not findable. So that's another example of how using disability accessibility, pardon me, I know for a lot of folks, handicap is not a term that we want to use. I do apologize. Using accessibility is a way of making your content more effective for all users. And then finally, something that people don't often think about is simply color contrast. And again, I'm going to later on demo a tool that will allow you to see how high contrast your website or your social media posts are. And this again can help folks who are low vision be able to access your information with less frustration. Now, for our deaf and hard of hearing users, we often think simply of captions, right? If you have content in a video such as this, and by the way, this video is being transcribed, you think if I put captions on all of my videos, I am all set. First of all, that's awesome. A lot of people are not even putting captions on their social media videos, even though you can now do it with just the click of a button on a TikTok or an Instagram. But a lot of folks are not doing any kind of captioning. And when you don't have captions, guess what? Your deaf users cannot really access your content. Now, much like screen readers for blind users, deaf users typically do have captioning software that will provide them with a caption of any videos that they encounter. However, it is unreliable if you have not yourself proofread those captions. So in other words, computers make mistakes all the time. We all know this. And so if you haven't actually provided your own captions, especially if you are speaking quickly or you have an accent, the captions will be very inaccurate. And therefore, deaf users will be at a disadvantage because they will not be getting an accurate transcription of what it is you're saying. This is why it's important to provide your own captions rather than simply relying on the captioning software that a deaf user might use, where you do not know what those captions are actually producing. Now, you can take things up a notch by not only providing captions, but by providing a transcript. A lot of users prefer to download the transcript, open it up in another window, and follow along with the transcript while you are speaking. It means that they can read at their own pace rather than relying on captions running past them. Hands up everybody who has, for instance, watched a film in a language that they don't speak and something really critical to the plot happens, but the subtitles went by so fast, you have no idea what just happened. And exactly, hi Sydney, we've all had that happen because it just, and then you're like, what? Wait, who was the murderer? They're elephants? What? Because you couldn't follow those captions. So a transcript is true accessibility, and they're easier than ever to use. I'm going to share some resources with everybody. Otter.ai is, to me, one of the most accurate of all of the AI tools that will render a transcript for you. But there's plenty of other tools out there. Temi, not Temu, the online shopping platform. Temi is also a really great tool, and that is available for free. And then finally, if you are doing live video, captions may be your only option, but if you have access to somebody who can do sign language interpretation when you're doing a live video, that can be absolutely critical, especially if it's important information. Again, captions are AI generated. They are not strictly accurate. Even with the tools like Otter AI that are really, really good for transcription, captioning happens on the fly. It has to be delivered quickly. It goes by very quickly. And so if you are doing a live broadcast, sign language interpretation, when available, is your best bet. Now, obviously, we here are hosting a live webinar, and I am not doing sign language interpretation because I simply could not engage the services of a sign language interpreter. I know that this can be very difficult for all of us. Not everybody has a ton of budget. So again, these are all things that are great to have, but it is not always a legal requirement. You do what you can with the resources that you have. But transcripts and editing your own captions are very affordable for us all to do and can make a huge difference for our users who are deaf and hard of hearing. So apologies, for some reason my touchpad is incredibly sensitive, which actually cues up the next topic very nicely. Accessibility for people with mobility impairments. And that's pretty much all of us, isn't it? I have carpal tunnel in my hands. I do have a mobility impairment because of that. I have difficulties clicking on things. I have difficulties getting a touchpad to cooperate. But people have various different amounts of mobility. And also, naturally, in this touchscreen world, did you know that as we get older, our hands become drier and touch screens like the trackpad on your computer or the screen on your phone are dependent on the moisture in your hand for detecting motion. This is why we often, in fact, there was a study saying that a lot of times when older users are stigmatized as being less competent with technology because they click and nothing happens, it's not that at all. It's that touch devices were designed for people with young skin. And as your skin ages, touch devices literally ignore you. They literally cannot detect the skin texture of older users. So the short answer obviously is always keep a lot of moisturizer by your desk and I have two of these now. I'm 47 and I am keeping the moisturizer industry in business. But other than that, people may also develop a tremor. They may develop carpal tunnel syndrome. That can cause you to have weaker grip strength or less fine motor control. And so we're all going to get there, whether it's just dry skin or it's something else. Keyboard navigation is going to be more and more important for all of us because, again, those touch screens are not aging population friendly. And we shouldn't all just have to run to Sephora all the time buying more and more moisturizer. Larger touch targets are also really important. You want to increase the size of any buttons or any interactive elements for easy touch access. Clickable text is not friendly to anybody with larger hands who is older or who has any kind of mobility impairment. You want buttons and you want there to be a lot of white space around the button so that people can't accidentally click the wrong thing. You want a big button with an ample amount of white space around it. The right amount of white space is actually mandated within WCAG. It will give you down to the number of pixels how much space there should ideally be around a button. So definitely take a look at the link that I'm sending, but overall, just test it out with your users on different devices, on phones of different screen sizes, on touchpads, and with mice to see how clickable things are. But also make sure that all site functionality is also accessible via the keyboard controls, because people with more advanced or different mobility impairments, such as people who don't have the use of their hands and who navigate using a device that they hold in their mouth, for instance, or who navigate using nodding their head, they may not be able to access a touch target at all using their assistive devices. And so they actually have to navigate using the buttons on the keyboard. So if you take a look on your keyboard, you can see the up, down, sideways buttons. There are people who are navigating your website right now using those up, down, sideways buttons. And so a lot of times, especially fancier websites, those are disabled. You can't use them. They've been turned off. And so you want to make sure that keyboard navigation is accessible to everybody. You also want to make sure that people can adjust the layout and the font and other settings on your website so that they can zoom in so that if they need to make sure that the touch targets are closer in, that they can simply zoom in and gain access to those touch targets. So we often don't think of mobility impairments as much as we think of deafness and blindness, but they are actually one of the most common impediments to people being able to use your website. And again, when we think about the benefits of accessibility, much like alt text helping you with your SEO and helping you with being accessible to people who simply have images turned off by their employer in their email, just as transcripts, by the way, are also very helpful for your SEO, because if you publish that transcript as a web page or even as a PDF, Google can crawl that transcript, and your content that was in that transcript will be more findable by people searching on the web, as well as people simply enjoy a transcript and they like to read it. Not everyone even just likes to watch videos. So you'll reach more people of all abilities. Well, same thing with accessibility for mobility impairment. It's good for everybody because, as I say, people are on all different kinds of sizes of screens, navigating in all different kinds of ways. A lot of times, even if somebody is very mobile, they might be simply on the train and they're hanging on with one hand and they're navigating with just one other hand. And if your website is frustrating and your competition's website is easy to navigate with one hand, guess where your customers are going to go? So all of these things can be an easy way for people to navigate your website. But we often think of physical abilities only when we think of website accessibility, and we completely ignore cognitive and learning disabilities. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about cognitive and learning disabilities. I'm going to zoom out here because I think some of the content was not showing up on my screen. And let's talk about how do we make something accessible for people who are of dyslexia or a learning disability. That's often greatly ignored when we talk about site accessibility. But again, this is another area where what you do for your users with disabilities actually positively impacts your site's performance for everybody. Number one thing you're going to want to do when you're making something accessible for people with dyslexia and a learning disability is use plain language. It should be clear and concise. Don't use complex jargon and avoid figurative language. There's a couple of reasons why you want to do that. One is that people who are autistic, for instance, even if they understand figurative language, find it very frustrating. They find it annoying. And if you annoy your users, you've already lost them. So using plain descriptive language, avoiding metaphors, avoiding figurative language makes it easier for autistic users. It also, by the way, makes it easier for people who speak English or whatever language your website is in as a second language, because metaphors generally do not translate terribly well from one language to another. If you're multilingual, think of a funny phrase in your native language and then try to translate that literally into another language and just listen to yourself, right? It could be hilarious. It could even be inappropriate. So using plain language is inclusive, not only for learning disabilities, but also for people with different levels of command of the language that your website is in. For instance, Invisible Giant's website is in French. I last studied French as an undergraduate. It's not, my French is okay, but if a website in French is filled with figurative language, it's going to take me so long to figure out what it is that I will have given up. So that's one reason why you're going to use plain, concise, clear, direct language. And again, obviously, if you're an artist, Kumba obviously is a creative writer. I do creative writing. This doesn't mean don't do creative writing, but just don't put that as the public face of your website. Make sure that you also have some accessible content there as well. The other thing you want to do is you want to keep your reading level somewhere between 6th and 8th grade reading level. So there are tools for Anglophone websites, in other words, in the English language, that will actually tell you what reading level your website is at. In fact, I will demo some of those for you and share some links of those as well, because you want to make sure that you're avoiding long sentences and big paragraphs and breaking information into bite-sized scannable chunks. Now, obviously, all of us are very busy. This is beneficial to all of your users. It's especially useful for people, however, who have reading-related disabilities like dyslexia. When people have dyslexia, and I will show you a demo of what dyslexia looks like, oftentimes their eyes have a hard time deciphering shapes of letters. So again, if you put a lot of white space between small chunks of information, it's easier for people with dyslexia to decipher all of the letters. But again, think of that user who is maybe not disabled, but they are already navigating your website with one thumb on the phone while their other hand is hanging on the subway or holding on to a child, and they're navigating with one thumb. They already have impaired mobility simply because of their situation. They also probably have an impaired reading level. Even if you can read on the PhD level when you have all the time in the world to concentrate, when you are busy, when you are distracted, you are not going to be able to read at your full reading level. So accessibility is not just about people with physical differences. In the accessibility world, we talk about temporary and permanent disabilities. In other words, if someone always uses a wheelchair, they have a permanent disability. If someone has broken their ankle, they have a temporary disability. But there's a third category of disability called situational disability. And that's when you are in a situation that makes it impossible to use all of the abilities that you physically have. Maybe you've lost your glasses. Now you are a low vision user until you find your glasses. Maybe you have only one hand free because you're on the subway. Now you are mobility impaired during that subway ride. We are all distracted, and therefore most of us in our day-to-day tasks can only comprehend information at a reading level of 6th to 8th grade. So keep with that. The other thing you want to do is have a strong visual hierarchy for your website. Organize the content with clear headings, subheadings, and bullet points, because again, regardless of whether someone has a learning disability or whether they simply are distracted or they have dyslexia, this is going to make the site more accessible to them. Whether you're dealing with somebody, and again, pardon me for all of these touch target issues, with a cognitive disability or again, just busy users, three other things you want to think about for users with cognitive disabilities are: maintain a consistent layout. Use the same patterns, element placement, and visual hierarchy on each page to help users build a mental model and navigate easily. This can also help with users who are not digital natives, people who grew up before there were computers. This can help enormously, regardless of what their cognitive abilities are. If people see that the button to get back to the homepage is always on the top right, if your menus look the same everywhere, if important information is always the way you see on this screen in columns on the bottom of the page, people will know to look in the same place all the time for important information or for a link back to the homepage or so on and so forth. You also want to make sure that your navigation is highly intuitive. There have to be clear labels on everything that people can click on, and the categories need to make sense. So for instance, we recently at ThoughtLight designed a website for a pet grooming and pet food company. And originally, they're a wonderful client, but their website had not been designed by a professional. And so, for instance, they have like 4 different kinds of products to clean your pet, different kinds of dry shampoos, soaps, and regular shampoos. They were all over the website. You never knew where you were going to find them. They were just literally in a list thrown in with dog treats and chew toys and beds and everything else. And they were complaining that they weren't getting enough conversions on their website. But once we looked at their site, it was obvious that it was impossible for anyone to find anything, because let's say you want to, clean your horse, and they do have horse shampoo. Where are you going to find that? It's under the dog toys. Why is it under the dog toys? Nobody knows. So what we did is we reorganized the website so that all cleaning products are organized in one place. But what if you're not thinking in terms of cleaning products, you're thinking in terms of the pet that you have? So in other words, you're looking for only products for dogs. Well, then you also want to have a collection of those same products, those cleaning products, but now the dog cleaning product is the only thing there, along with the dog toys, the dog treats, the dog vitamins, the dog food, etc. Think about how people categorize information. They probably don't want to wade through a bunch of random things that have nothing to do with each other, but they also don't all think alike. Some people think in terms of cleaning products and then look for cleaning products specific to a certain type of animal. Some people think in terms of, I have a dog, and then they look for products for dogs of all different kinds. So in addition to intuitive navigation, that's a really big catchword for word, but we don't know intuitive for whom, right? What's intuitive for me may not be intuitive for you. So think of the multiple different ways people might categorize your information and try to create duplicate pathways to the same information. There are currently on that website 4 different ways to get to the dog shampoo. It's under dog grooming products, it's under soaps and grooming products, etc., etc. And that allows people, regardless of how they think or of categorize and describe information, to find that same piece of information. Now, in spite of all of these multiple different ways of navigating your way to something, you also want to have a decluttered design. A lot of these things, inconsistent layout, unintuitive navigation, and a super cluttered design, are a result of people prioritizing aesthetics over usability. It's always more important to have a less aesthetically fancy site that is more usable. So forget all the bells and whistles, forget trying 16 different layouts so that the menu is hopping around all over the screen, different places for different categories, because it's cool to have the menu look 12 different kinds of ways. It's not cool to the poor person who is now completely lost on your website, regardless of their cognitive abilities. You want to make sure, and by the way, this happens to everybody. This has nothing to do with cognitive disabilities. We have all been that poor person lost on a website. But it gets much more difficult if someone does have cognitive disabilities. So maintain a consistent layout, intuitive navigation, and a decluttered design. Have multiple different kinds of users test out your design to find what works for multiple different kinds of people. So that is disability inclusion in a nutshell. I'm going to demo a couple of tools because I know that we are almost at 10:40 and I want to open this up to questions in about 10 minutes. So I'm going to very briefly, however, talk about other elements of inclusiveness when it comes to your website. Make sure that in addition to accessibility considerations, you are also visually representing people with different abilities in your content. Nothing says we are not welcoming to people with different abilities than if everybody on your website is under 50 and able-bodied. So make sure you have a wide range of identities, perspectives, and experiences represented in your content to reflect your audience, to signal to people that you are a welcoming site. A lot of times when people say, oh, our website is diverse, they're thinking of pictures like this one on the left. But how diverse is this really? It has people of maybe 3 genders. You've got women, men, and possibly a non-binary person, and it has people with different complexions. But everybody in the photo appears to be 26 years old. They're all thin, they're all tall, they're all able-bodied. The guy in the back's wearing glasses. They're even dressed alike. So a lot of times people will say our imagery is inclusive, but it isn't really. People will often put in a little gender diversity, a little racial diversity, and call it a day. But at the end of the day, that is not really being all that diverse, because you're still showing that this is a website that mostly focuses on young, able-bodied people. So you want to show a diversity of ages and abilities in order to truly signal that you have full accessibility. Now, all of these principles that I've shared translate very well to other aspects of your online presence. So we've talked about making your website accessible, let's talk very briefly about making your social media accessible as well, because for a lot of organizations, their website is secondary to their social media to reaching their audiences. They're actually more active in reaching more people on social media than they are reaching people on the web. So it's critical not to ignore your social media when you're doing accessibility. So the good news here is that if you're WCAG compliant already with your website, you have the tools and skills that you need to be accessible with your social media. Because again, you're starting with alt text for all of your images. Instagram provides its own alt text the same way that screen readers are supposedly able to read all content on the web, and the same way that deaf users typically do have their own captioning software, but the same caveat applies. If you're relying on the platform to create your accessibility for you, it's probably not accessible. Instagram's alt text is going to use an AI, and it's going to just, for instance, let's say you have a picture of the iconic 1980s cartoon character Garfield. And that means something really specific to the people who are reading your website. Maybe you're catering to Gen Xers and you want to signal to Gen Xers that this is a place where people of our generation will find like-minded folks. Instagram may see that and simply say cartoon cat and not say Garfield the cat. And therefore, the entire cultural resonance of that image is completely lost. You have to proactively look at every image that you post to social media and think of what's really important. What is the message that I'm trying to convey? And then create alt text, create descriptive text that conveys your message. Don't rely on the platform. The platform will simply give a bare bones description that will probably miss the entire point, because computers are good at one thing. And that, if you've been using ChatGPT for anything, you probably guess what it is. It's missing the entire point. AI will miss the entire point. The same goes for captions. Make sure that you're generating your own captions, that you're editing them, and that you're using them to highlight key points that you want to make. Rather than just relying on captioning, you can make certain important points bold or change the font for them, or do little pop-ups with key words that you want to repeat. And again, this will make your content more accessible, not just to deaf users, but to your users who have hearing as well, because it's going to be more accurate and more engaging. And again, remember to continue to be very diverse in your content. Nowhere more so than in social media do we see a complete lack of representation, oftentimes, of people of differing abilities or ages or socioeconomic backgrounds. Everybody on social media is young and gorgeous, and you don't want your social media to be guilty of that. If you're on TikTok or you're creating Instagram Reels, you should be aware that TikTok has a really nice text-to-speech feature. So if you're putting interesting information into your captions, TikTok has a built-in feature that will allow all of that text to be transformed into speech. So putting really rich captions on your Reels and on your TikToks is actually going to translate very nicely in that environment. The other thing you want to make sure of is that TikTok is pretty good about this, as are Instagram Reels, making sure you have accurate, well-timed captions. Again, we talked about that before, but again, make sure the timings are correct on that, because one thing that can go wrong with auto-generated captions is, again, is they fly by too quickly. Make sure you slow down how you speak so that it is easy for people, again, to follow along with your captions. Another thing that people often don't think about when they're creating content for social media, whether it's TikTok, whether it's Instagram, whether it's Facebook, is actually, how do these videos look? Because for somebody who is visually impaired, poor lighting, a lack of color contrast, or a really cluttered background can make the difference between them being able to see what's going on the screen and not being able to see what's going on the screen. So if you are creating TikToks where it's just you talking to a camera and you're making an important point that's conveyed completely through your words, you don't necessarily need to worry about this. Certainly, we all want to be well lit. We want to have a professional look and feel to our videos. But if your words are what matter, you can make sure, just get a cheap $20 ring light and you should be okay. But if, on the other hand, you are doing demos, you're doing how-to videos, it's important for people to see what is happening on the screen to gain meaning from the content. Make sure you have the best lighting that you can afford. Maybe invest in a light box if you're doing demos, where you then put the content into the light box, which has a nice clear background, high color contrast, and simple layouts, because that's going to make things easier for people to follow. It's little things. For instance, if I am doing a hands-on demo, I am an avid sewist. I like to make quilts. If I'm doing a hands-on demo and my hands are being filmed, I will literally get red nail polish, even if I normally would be wearing pink, so that the tips of my fingers are more easily visible. And that's because I have light complexioned hands. If you have dark complexioned hands, you might want to get really, really pale, like light, bright yellow nail polish. But again, make sure this contrast down to that level so that the tips of your fingers are visible while you're doing a demo. Use tools that contrast with the materials that you're working on. So for instance, if you're showing people how to cut something with scissors, using pale gray scissors on pale gray fabric isn't going to work. Get dark fabric if you have light scissors, and vice versa. And again, lights, 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 because no description in the world is going to necessarily help people if you don't have something well shot for low vision people. So all of the same thing applies to Facebook, but Facebook is somewhat lagging behind Instagram and TikTok in the built-in accessibility tools. So the only additional tip that I have for Facebook is really be detailed in your alt text. There's no fallback within Facebook. You want to make sure your alt text is so detailed, and you may even need to put it into the post caption itself. So instead of actually relying on it when you upload it, put a description into the post itself. By the way, that also applies even for Instagram. If you're using a tool, like one tool that we use, for instance, at Brandeis University is called Juicer Feed, that actually strips out all of the alt text if it's feeding the content into your web page, and you need to actually put your alt text into your posts themselves. And again, make sure that you're editing all of your captions, because whenever I've had issues with captions, it's almost always on Facebook. So all of the same principles apply, but be doubly careful on Facebook because it does lag behind a little bit. TikTok is actually the most accessible, and Instagram is in the middle. But if you're using captioning and you're providing good alt text, you should be all set on all of those. So again, to summarize best practices for accessible and inclusive digital content, write for clarity, use plain, easy to understand language, avoid complex sentence structure, unnecessary complexity of any kind, and jargon, slang, or figurative language. Design for accessibility using the WCAG guidelines, and that includes sufficient color contrast, text sizing, clear visual hierarchy, make your content easily navigable, including with keyboard controls and appropriate touch targets. Make sure all of your images have clear alt text descriptions that actually tell you what's going on in the image. Make sure you create your own captions for all of your videos, and provide transcripts. It's never been easier to provide transcripts to make sure that people can access all of your video content. And again, really make sure to embrace diversity in your visuals as well. Use inclusive and representative imagery and language that really represent your true audience, rather than simply relying on stock images that show only one profile of humanity. So that's what I have today for our lecture. I want to actually demonstrate a couple of tools using the New York Times to give you an example of how to utilize these tools that create accessibility. So the first one that I want to show you is a very useful free browser plugin called Silktide. It's again free for Chrome. Just look up silktide.com, and I will also share a link with this in the follow-up. And what it's going to do is it will tell you whether your web page has good color contrast. You can see here, it actually gives you a 21:1 ratio, and it's actually rates as AAA, the highest level of compliance with WCAG. It's got a WCAG tester for everything. And it will tell you how compliant you are with WCAG. But what I want to show you right now is it will also do a full accessibility audit on your page and give you a complete analysis of how accessible your site is for color contrast, as well as screen reader usage. But I'm going to tell you this, it's not a substitute for a manual review. So first and foremost, it's going to tell you that your headings are impossible for a screen reader to read. It's missing what are called ARIA labels, which are labels that will signal to an assistive device what types of content it is. Links are too close to each other. Alt text is duplicative, which means that on this New York Times website, several completely different images are all described in the exact same way. Links are sending people to different destinations, which again, there's no text explaining where the link is going to take people, and all of these are inaccessible to a screen reader. So let me show you what a person who is deaf.
The New York Times, breaking news,
Oops,
US
hang on.
news, world news and videos.
Let me show you what a user who is blind will see if they are using a screen reader to access your site. So again, in Silk Tide, I'm going to go to screen reader.
The New York Times, breaking news, US news, world
I'm going
news
to
and
start reading
videos.
it to you. That's it. It just read that. Let me find another article. Let me run the screen reader on it again.
Netanyahu will address Congress. Harris and some Democrats won't be there. The New York Times.
Well, that's great. I'm not really getting anything out of this. And so you can see here.
Link skip to content. Link skip to site index. Dialog pop-up collapsed. Collapsed. But link New York Times homepage. Dialog pop-up collapsed. But entered main. Link the New York Times homepage. Link. Menu live updates July 24th. List item live updates July 24th. Menu item updates. List item poll tracker.
Now, if you could hear that, if you are a blind user, have you been able to get any kind of information out of this page? No, because all you keep hearing is menu item collapse, menu item, list menu item, link, and it doesn't even tell you where the link is. This is a news article, and all I keep
Menu
hearing
item poll
is
tracker.
menu item poll
List item
tracker.
Harris's VP, contenders.
It's even talking about completely different topics. Now you don't even know what this article is about. Is it about the vice president choice? Is it about Netanyahu's visit to the United States? I don't know. So if I can't see this page, I have now been exposed to, I don't even know what information, because the navigation is all being read by the screen reader. Now, a screen reader can skip over the navigation, but it does only if the navigation is clearly labeled as extraneous information that you can skip. Otherwise, it's going to read literally everything on the page to you, and you have just lost your blind users because they have no idea what this was about. So that is one tool that I find incredibly helpful. There are also a variety of reading level trackers. Now, if you have Grammarly, you already have a reading level checker. It's also available in Microsoft. But if you want something independent, there's something called Data Eyes. It's a readability scanner, and it will rate anything that you have written. You can just paste your content right in here, and it's going to measure your readability across a variety of different scales that are used in K through 12. This is going to be very helpful to you if you are trying to manage the reading level of your content. In addition to that, there's something called the focus order, which will, again, tell you how navigable your website is for people using just the up and down buttons on their keyboard to navigate your website. And as you can see here, this website is completely being hijacked by this ad. You can see the green squares. If someone is trying to navigate this, they are only gaining access to the ads. They're not gaining access to any other piece of the content. Now, if somebody has dyslexia, let me go back to the New York Times for this one, you can simulate what that looks like as well. So again, I'm using Silktide. There's plenty of other tools out there, but let's say you're trying to simulate mild dyslexia. Here's what a dyslexic person is going to see. You see how, because this page is relatively well laid out with good use of a clear font, literally Times New Roman, as well as having clear boxes of information. If somebody's dyslexic, they're still well able to navigate this page. But let's say you get into a particular news article, and let's say there you're a dyslexic user. Now it gets a little harder to navigate because you're looking at blocks of text interrupted only with ads, no headings, and now suddenly the text looks very, very jumbled, and adding a couple of handy little headings would minimize this navigation problem. You can also see where any of the navigate landmarks are, which would allow people to see where the main and side pieces of information are. And you can see here, all of these major landmarks, half of them are occupied with ad space or are completely blank. So again, if somebody's using keyboard shortcuts to navigate, they're not really getting terribly well guided across the website. You can see here that overall the New York Times is doing a fairly good job of describing any important images. So for instance, they are describing who is in all of the pictures. One of 13 sharp-nosed sharks caught in Rio de Janeiro. All of this is very clear alt text. So it's going to scan and look at all of your alt text as well. It's also going to look at your focus order. Where would the eye tend to move on this website? And this is for people of all abilities. And you can see here, the ads are very distracting to people. The image is really grabbing people's attention, but they're looking mostly at the bottom because of the structure of it. And the eye is glancing straight through the ads and not able to pay a lot of focus attention to the text because it's not really well structured. So this is one tool of many. Again, you can easily find dozens of these tools online. Crazy Egg will give you some heat mapping, for instance. Again, the text analyzer will tell you what your reading level is, but Silktide is a free tool, and I'll also list a couple of other free tools that will allow you to check your accessibility. There's no reason not to be doing accessibility in this day and age because we have so many free tools out there that will enable us to make our websites accessible to all different kinds of users. Now, when it comes to accessible visuals, obviously all of the major stock photo houses are trying to create more accessible visuals, but there are also some great libraries of accessible graphics available to us, and I will include some of those as well. Pexels is one of them, and they have a lot of really great diverse content that will enable you to have a much more representative group of people showcased on your website. So we're almost at time now. I want to thank everybody for joining us. I also wanted to open it up to any questions. I didn't see any questions popping up in the chat, so I want to welcome everybody now to ask any questions if they have any.
Hey, thank you. I just want to say thank you. People, try to ask questions. I don't know if it's open and if they can speak directly, if their mic, if they can control it. But just thank you for this. It's extremely, it's extremely so much learning. And I guess to me, what it does really, in terms of accessibility, what it is what we've been talking about around accessibility, even outside of the digital world, when we make things accessible for people who actually need it, it becomes luxury for those who don't need it. That's exactly where we're so happy to hear what people have questions. Definitely want to test some of these pieces that you just shared. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Kumba. And again, if anyone wants to raise their hand to ask any questions. Fire away. Marie Ellen. I will open it up to you. Hang on a moment. All right, you can now unmute yourself.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. Greetings, dear all. My name is Mary Helen, and I am the coordinator of the Invisible Giants program. Sorry, I just wanted to thank you for this insightful training, because we at Invisible Giants, inclusion is fundamental for us. It is very important. Not only did we celebrate Invisible Giants, but also we used to organize discussions with them, invite them to share their histories regarding disability. That's the reason why we really appreciate this training. It will allow us to include them more online and in person. That was just to thank you, to show you how important it is for us regarding the Invisible Giants program. We celebrate them, people with disability. Then if we have the occasion to include them more on our online thing, it's very important. That's the reason why sometimes we're doing remote celebration, because inclusion, people living with disability, vulnerable people, these are fundamental for us, because everybody should be in. And I think that's this training. This training is all about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all of the incredible work that you do in the community, uplifting voices of women and people with disabilities. I think it's incredible what you're doing, so thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, we are at time. I want to thank everybody who came out. If you have any questions to follow up, I'm going to put my email in the chat. So please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. Also, everybody who was on this webinar is going to receive a link to the recording, a set of resources, all of them free, for making your website more accessible or to accessible media and imagery, as well as the transcript for this. So watch for that follow-up and feel free to respond to that follow-up if you have any questions. I'm always happy to help, and always happy to provide any guidance to people wanting to create a more accessible and inclusive online presence. With that, on behalf of everybody at Memria and Thoughtlight, I want to thank you for coming out. Kumba, over to you for some final words.
Just again, thank you, thank you. I think we will use this training to of course look again at our website, the Invisible Giant website, but also share with other partners and people that we've been working with to change how we do things online. Thank you so much. This is really a great learning, and I think it's just the beginning for us to start going further in this. The last thing that I will say is that one of the things that we've been also talking about disabilities, like you said, it's about different abilities. It's the fact that we know now that people might not have certain abilities in certain places, but then have more abilities in others, and that those are something that we can also uplift and show that it's very different, and that's what we need to really celebrate. And I was touched specifically by the situational ability that you underline, which then make a lot of people understand better what it means, to be, when it's not situational, when you keep, when you live in it for a long time. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for everyone for being here. And thanks again for doing your part to make the world a more inclusive and accessible place. Thank you all, and
Thank
we'll
you.
sure an email with follow-up. And thanks again to Kumba and our partners at Invisible Giants for supporting this webinar. And thanks to everybody for attending. Take care and have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.